report is also highly relevant in regard to the general trend of digitalization in education and training that gained quite momentum with distant education during the COVID-19 school closures. In the report, we identified challenges, but also potentials and promising practices of digital education, especially regarding the education of disadvantaged learners. This can inform future strategies for digitalization and contribute to increased equity in education when the needs of disadvantaged learners are taken into consideration.
So if we look at the past 20 years, what is new for us, a global pandemic, has not actually been so new for education systems elsewhere in the world. For example, we had long-term school closures in West Africa because of the Ebola outbreak, but we've also had more short-term sporadic school closures in Asia because of the swine flu. And then, of course, there have been many natural disasters, for example, storms that have made school buildings inaccessible and therefore required education systems to adjust. And while this has happened mostly elsewhere in the world, the pandemic has shown that Europe is not immune to natural disasters and global pandemics. And since such events accentuate the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of children, social inequalities will only grow in Europe if we don't learn how to mitigate the effects on social inequalities that these kind of disasters may have. And our report is a first step for stakeholders to indeed understand that different crisis measures affect children and education systems differently, and that future crisis plans need to be made more inclusive, because the pandemic was unprecedented for us, but it will surely not be the last of such events that will hit Europe in the future. So it's most important to consider first that we looked at school closures and how school closures affected the learning progress of children. And as we all know, the moment that the school closes and switched online, there were some initial gaps and challenges, some hinderings, interruptions in education that caused some short-term learning loss. But it's important to consider that, especially as the pandemic led on and as the school closures were longer, the gaps that occur in learning loss can have longer term impact on children's opportunities later in life. For example, in terms of their health and social inclusion, their active participation, which is all linked to educational progress, but also in terms of course, their labor opportunities. And in this regard, if you consider that we're talking about a whole generation of children, the COVID pandemic can have very significant impact on the socio-economic developments of a country. But in our report, we looked specifically at children who were more vulnerable to such challenges in their educational progress. And children who are more vulnerable to gaps in education are usually the ones who have additional vulnerabilities like migration status or socioeconomic background, which means that these children are already affected by existing social inequalities in the country. And our report showed that these children who suffer more from gaps in their learning are therefore more likely to also suffer these long-term consequences in terms of their opportunities later in life. And it means that in order to avoid a huge increase in social inequality in Europe and actually in the world, there are a variety of measures needed to compensate for this inequality. And we're talking not just about some remedial teaching, but also longer term development plans that help children to re-engage with education in case they dropped out, but also to develop lifelong learning plans, opportunities to engage in the labor market, and to account for other non-formal learning that they may have missed during this time, to make sure that the challenges they face now do not translate into lifelong disadvantages.
Yes, we know that different groups of learners were affected unequally by school closures. The resulting additional challenges to learning equality added to existing inequalities in education systems, especially in reference to disadvantaged groups such as children with special education needs and disabilities, children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and children with a refugee or migrant background. We approached the distribution of the effects of school closures on the education of disadvantaged learners through the concepts of vulnerability and resilience. And we subdivided both into personal, which are factors like age, gender, ethnicity, contextual, for example, the intended or unintended results of a policy, and situational factors of vulnerabilities and resilience, which are based on particular life events such as the pandemic. In most cases, those concerned are affected by a number of different factors and categories of vulnerability and resilience at the same time, which exacerbate or mitigate their situation. What makes this approach interesting for this report is that the understanding of vulnerabilities enables us to identify measures aimed at reducing or mitigating the negative impact of factors of vulnerability on education, whereas identifying resilience factors can enable measures to capitalize upon them. A number of the vulnerabilities and resilience factors that were identified, especially those on a personal and contextual level, existed before the outbreak of COVID-19, but their impact on the education of affected learners has been exacerbated by the pandemic. In contrast, situational vulnerabilities and resilience factors are direct results of COVID-19 school closures or responses to them. For example, on the level of personal and contextual factors, learners from families with lower educational or socioeconomic backgrounds, migrant or refugee learners, and Sinti and Roma learners were vulnerable before school closures because their parents had been less able to support them at home, they had less access to learning resources, and some of them had been learning the language of instruction, among others. During school closures now, the parental effect was exacerbated because many parents of these learner groups were not able to work from home, so they were not around to support them. They were also often occupied with fundamental issues such as the risk of job loss or asylum procedures. The closure of most social support services left parents and children who depended on them stranded. Moreover, these groups of learners also often did not have sufficient learning space and sufficient access to digital devices and internet, and lacked skills and support in using them. In some cases, learners did not even have access to internet at all, for example, refugees in some reception centers. The features of educational platforms also that were used by schools were often not suitable for learners of the language of instruction and children with disabilities and special education needs. And for these groups, the individual support that teachers would often provide was lacking during distant education. At the same time, though, we identified factors of resilience, such as governmental and non-governmental initiatives that stepped in to meet special needs of learners, as well as learner-based factors such as positive student engagement, the sense of belonging to school, and feelings of self-worth. These factors can mitigate vulnerabilities to a certain extent. On the situational level, however, all learners were mostly affected in a similar way. Situational factors of vulnerabilities that we identified include the lack of interaction, risk of violence and abuse, school capacity, and teacher competence. We observed quite large differences in how schools and individual teachers were coping with the situation, and this affected students considerably. Interestingly, schools' distant teaching provisions explain the largest part of variations in children's home learning and carry the potential to moderate disparities generated by parental and ethnic backgrounds. Overall, I think we can say the study confirmed the strong interplay of factors of resilience and vulnerability in the context of COVID-19 school closures. This again influenced the extent to which disadvantaged children experienced disappropriate disruption to their learning progress compared with their peers. These learning disruptions during school education will significantly impact their opportunities later in life, not only in terms of income, but also with regard to their overall socio-economic development and their position in society.
The main lesson that we learned from the pandemic is that we are not as flexible as we think. We saw that schools and other education institutions were able to switch incredibly fast from face-to-face to online learning. And this is commendable, that it definitely is. But we need to remember that so many children were still left out from quality education and suffered disproportionately. It's important that we learn that crisis management and emergency response is not something that is just for first responders or for national emergency statuses, but it's also for education systems, and that emergency plans should be put in place that have a strategy and a vision for how education should respond in case school closures, in case disaster happens. But moreover, what we saw during the pandemic is that education plans to mitigate the spread of COVID were very much top down. It was an emergency response from politicians to ensure, the safety of children. But because we were so unprepared, there was not much time to have extensive consultations with different stakeholders or impact assessments to determine what the effect of this would be. And therefore, of course, it was impossible to predict what we know now about the educational gaps, the learning gaps for vulnerable children. So what we know now and what we need to implement in the future is that we develop those education emergency plans that are based on broad consultation, that are based on discussion how this may impact children differently, so that if and when a new pandemic or a global disaster happens, we can implement crisis plans that are properly thought through and inclusive for all children.
I think that what we can also learn from the report is that in general, education policies during crisis time and non-crisis times should be guided by the principles of formal equality, which means that all children have equal rights and should be treated equally, and at the same time by the principle of substantive equality, which means that disadvantaged learners have to be treated differently through measures and policies that are designed to remove barriers that prevent them from achieving equal opportunities at the educational levels and in society.